We often think of altars as fixtures of worship. Typically in a sanctuary, it's a place right below the pulpit, and other physical places where we find altars there. But basically, they're there where sacred exchanges occur. But long before they became a part of any form of worship systems, before there were priesthoods, before there were any tabernacles or temple courts, altars existed in the wild. In the Bible, we see Abraham, the patriarch of the faith. He built the initial altars, but he built them not in the temples or any structured sanctuaries, but he built them basically in raw and in untamed places, spaces that were untouched by liturgy, and they were far from any institutional religion. And so these were not holy because of ceremony. These places weren't holy because of any ceremony practices. They became holy because God spoke there and Abraham responded. And so the first altar that Abraham built is recorded in Genesis 12, verse 7. And so immediately after the Lord had appeared to him and he made a covenantal promise to him, he said to him, to your offspring, I will give you this land. And so Abraham's response was not a strategic ritual or religious performance. It was an act of remembrance and basically territorial marking. The text plainly says this. It says, so he built there an altar to the Lord who had appeared to him. And so Abraham's altar was a theological response to a divine initiative. God had appeared, God spoke, and Abraham acted, not to initiate worship, but to memorialize revelation. And so we find that in the ancient Near Eastern context, that this was an act. A subversive altars act. Were very common in pagan cultures, but they were built to manipulate or to secure divine favor. Sacrifices were transactional. They were offered to gods who were unpredictable, unstable, or perceived to be unstable because, they had to be appeased in some light. But Abraham does something that's fundamentally different. He repurposes. He takes this cultural form and he repurposes it. He takes it and he fills it with covenantal meaning. He doesn't sacrifice to get God's attention. He sacrifices because he already got it. The altar stands as a witness and not a tool of some type of persuasion, as though he has to move God. And so the next altar that he built right after the first altar was built in Genesis 7. In Genesis 12:8, we see Abraham moving east, and then he pitches his tent between Bethel, which means the house of God, and between Ai, which is the heap of ruins. Now, this is an incidental geography. Abraham builds an altar between what symbolically represents divine presence and devastation. And that alone preaches, right there alone. You could preach that all day. His worship is located in the tension, that place of stress between the promise and between the ruin. And this is deeply theological moment. Is very deep in its meaning, because Abraham doesn't wait until he arrives fully in the promise. He does not worship only in the comfort of Bethel, nor does he retreat back to Ai, to the devastation, but he builds an altar in the in-between, making space for the presence of God even before the fulfillment of God's promise. That's absolutely amazing. This altar marks a profound spiritual truth that faith responds to God in the middle of the journey, not just at the destination. Abraham's altars are reminders that worship is not based on settled outcomes, but it's based on trust in God's voice. Even when standing in between clarity, what's clear, I can see it, and the potentiality of it failing, of life failing for me. His altars reflect a theology of liminality, of transition. And this is where much of our modern worship fails to hold theological depth. We often invite people to the altar to give praise, and that we praise them enough, we do this, we turn around enough that the blessings will come down, okay? And so Abraham shows us what it means to worship God before we possess. And so as we follow Abraham through the land and continue on that journey, we see a pattern. After separation from Lot and receiving fresh confirmation of the promise, Abraham returns to the place where he had made an altar at first. And he goes back to the place of revelation again, and he builds. Now, these altars are sacred markers, not spaces for spectacle. They're not built in the times of emotional crisis or a manufactured revival. They don't need a revival. These are quiet testimonies to divine encounters. Now contrast this with the modern altar practices in much of the contemporary church cultures that we see today. Many churches maintain a designated altar area or practice altar calls, right? Sometimes with sincerity. I believe most of the time it is with sincerity, but it's often detached from the covenantal awareness, right, of the covenant. The altar in many circles, a place of emotional manufacture rather than theological response. People are invited to the altar week after week, not to remember God's voice, but to plead for an experience. The assumption is subtle, but it's corrosive, that God needs to be summoned, that out of our tears or performances, he's moved, as though God's grace needs to be provoked. And this is exactly what pagan altars are aimed to do, to manipulate the divine through sacrifice. But Abraham's example confronts this. He's not performing, he's not proclaiming, he's not striving to be seen. He is responding to being found. God found him. And we're still, in some churches, in most contexts, the altar becomes a stage for performance, where worship leaders prime the atmosphere for emotional response, and where recurring altar call conditions people to treat the space like a weekly confessional booth, rather than a site of covenantal remembrance. I remember in the book of 1 Kings, chapter 18, it's like Elijah confronting the prophets of Baal. We must ask, have we started dancing and cutting ourselves at the altar to provoke a God who is already near? In the book of Exodus, chapter 20, God gives clear instructions. He gives clear instructions. He says, in every place where I cause my name to be remembered, I will come to you and bless you. I'm going to say that again. In every place where I cause my name to be remembered, I will come to you and bless you. That is a theology of remembrance, not of ritual coercion. The altar is not a place where we get God to move. It's where we remember that he already has moved. There is also what I call a territorial dimension to Abraham's altar. And that's because every place he built one he was not just remembering what God said. He was claiming that ground. He was claiming that space. The altar wasn't personal, it was spatial. It declared, this place now belongs to God who appeared to me. And that's what made Abraham's altars dangerous in the Canaanite territory, because it spoke volumes. They were theological protest, not passive devotions. This is where the modern church must regain its footing. We need altars again, but not the kind that promote tears without transformation or repetition without revelation. We need altars that mark space in our hearts, in our homes, in our pulpits, in our cities, where God's voice was heard and his covenant remembered. We need to reclaim the altar as a place of covenant alignment, not emotional therapy, a place where territorial resistance to cultural idolatry, not assimilation to it. And we need to name the truth. Paganism has actually re-entered the sanctuary, and not always through statues or chants, but through practices that reflect pagan instincts. When emotions replace revelation, when leaders manipulate atmosphere instead of cultivating the memory, when worship becomes a tool to provoke God rather than to respond to him, we have drifted from Abraham's model and basically returned to AI. But even still today, the invitation stands. Return to the altar, not to the stage, not to our feelings, not to the formula, not to the altar. Like Abraham, reclaim those spaces, reclaim the wild places, build again, not because we're begging, because we're remembering, not to get God to show up, but to say with confidence that he already did.